I am here to investigate the disappearance of a young girl.
In the name of God, woman, what kind of mother are you? You're liars. You are despicable little liars.
Witchcraft is dead and discredited. Are you bent on reviving forgotten horrors? Witchcraft is dead. Witchcraft is dead. Witchcraft is dead. Are you bent on reviving forgotten horrors?
Somewhere around the end of the 1960s and the beginning of the 1970s, there was a triptych of films released by British directors. These were Witchfinder General in 1968, Blood on Satan's Claw in 1971, and perhaps the most famous of the three, The Wicker Man, released in 1973. These three texts are pretty much the foundation of what now gets called folk horror. And there was a variety of complex historical reasons why these films emerged when they did. The hippie and countercultural movements, the back to nature turn in Britain, and a broader cultural reevaluation of British history. The countercultural high point of 1968 gave us Witchfinder General, while the flames and embers of the Wicker Man's final sequence illuminated a post-Manson world when all of that countercultural potential had just burned into ash. In many ways, they're three very different films concerned with different ideas and themes, but what connects them all is the question of agency. This is what drives the horror, that underneath the skin of the world, the mundane reality to which we're all acclimated, there's this capacity, a subject that could remake the world. You might uncover a strange skull while ploughing your fields, or you might believe that all of England is enthralled to dark satanic powers. Or you might find yourself in a place that seems almost familiar, surrounded by people who think the world can only be maintained through sacrifice, through an appointment with the Wicker Man. There's a broader point here, right? Horror rests upon this disjunction, this gap between how we think the world operates and how it truly is. Adam Scoville, in their landmark book on folk horror, talks about it like this. Blood on Satan's Claw instantly places a malevolence upon its soil, highlighting its perspective view of Farmer Ralph from a deliberately low angle, as if the earth itself is glaring at him. Piers Haggard has him ploughing the land, an endless sticky mud covering his lower legs and machinery, giving the landscape a palpable, clawing sentience and agency. The land literally contains evil.
Day 6. First day alone in the research compound. Aside from a small patch of damp in the lower levels, this should be the perfect place for the next 12 months. Have started the ecological and mycological surveys. The initial spore dynamic maps look exceedingly promising. Compound is surrounded by a ring of what looks like an exceptionally large Calvatia craniformis, all sheer white, bat colony nearby. The mushrooms will be sporing soon.
It's a familiar feeling, right? One that hits the oldest and deepest parts of the brain, that unshakable feeling that comes when you're out late at night in the darkness of nature. That sibilant whisper that there's something out there in the woods, something growing, and it's coming for you.
Day 19. Heavy rain overnight. Lower level floorboards now retaining moisture, and the air in the basement is musty. On today's survey, spotted what appears to be clusters of psilocybe caerulescens, but with some curious differences. Perhaps a local species or a genetic mutation. Spore behavior doesn't match that with normative dynamic patterns. The growth seems particularly aggressive. Something strange about it. Returned to the research compound to find 3 large bats, dead at the entrance. Blood in the eyes and mouth. Bodies covered in a fine white powder. Buried the bodies in the woods. Painful headache most of the rest of the day.
Really, when you understand it that way, the foundational texts of folk horror become points of epistemological crisis. The Wicker Man is probably the classic example here. The metaphysics of detection rest upon the assumption that the world can, in some way, be made sense of. For the detective, the world is a mystery, and solving it involves decoding and understanding patterns of causality, finding the acting subject, and then, of course, being confronted by your inability to even understand it in the first place. And don't get me wrong, this isn't something that collapses into rational, correct interpretations of the world versus the irrational. Sergeant Howie is, after all, devoutly religious, a good, dour Scottish Calvinist. The problem isn't that Summerisle is irrational. The problem is that it seems to rest upon a different understanding of a gentle capacity.
Day 37. Rained solidly for the past 122 hours. Floorboards in the lower section of the compound rotting will collapse with the slightest touch. The rain gets in everywhere. Air heavy with the scent of mushrooms. Opened a supply chest looking for my spare boots to find what looked like a collection of large Pizziza domiciliana running through everything. It must have grown overnight. Everything rotten. My eyes hurt in the light, and it seems like there are shapes out in the woods.
This is a pretty common pattern within folk horror as a form too. What is confronted, what's summoned at the culmination of a folk horror story is a kind of weird agency. The world is structured and ordered in a particular way, a way that might even be unthinkable for those who are forced to confront it. There's a friction here. The way that we thought the world was is revealed to be a complete illusion. After all, what are demonic rites, witches, covens, occult ceremonies, but attempts to channel and respond to the weird agencies that structure existence? What do you do when you come across an agency that can reorder the world? I mean, seen that way, the folk horror revival of the last few years does make a kind of sense, right? We've lived through generational crisis upon crisis, and anyone who's turned on the news or, looked out the window can see the ways in which the natural world constantly eludes our own agency. Try as we might to think otherwise, the world is simply not just there for us. We're so vulnerable, aren't we? No wonder we're drawn to folk horror, to the encounter between two different kinds of agency, because if there was something out there, something that ordered the world, that made it all make sense, even with all of the blood and horror, wouldn't that be better? But here's something I've been thinking about. What if the gap that renders an encounter between the I and the weird agency somewhere out there in the world was to be removed? What if it, whatever it might be, is not out there somewhere? Maybe it was once, but what if it was close to you? What if it was in your house? What if it was in the same room as you? What if it was under your skin? What if it was behind your eyes? What if it was already inside your head?
Day 79. Painful headache returned. My chest hurts. My lungs feel like they're full of sand. White spots when I close my eyes. Under the skin, I can feel something move, something growing. Something's not right here. I'm leaving tonight for the woods, and out there I might find...
In The Last of Us, the world has been taken over by a mutation of Ophiocordyceps unilateralis, a pathogenic fungus that attaches itself to insects and fruits additional bodies via its host. The zombie ant you've perhaps seen online, pathogenic fungus. What's so interesting is how cordyceps have naturally figured out how to grow on a variety of hosts. And for the world in The Last of Us, well, this is basically what ended everything. Humans are exposed to infection via person-to-person contact, bites, but also through inhalation, after which the mutation begins attacking the host's brain and fundamentally and permanently changing their behavior. The stages of infection occur over time, so the longer an infected human lives, the more likely they are to, change. Infected Stage 1. Cordyceps have taken over the victim's motor functions. Fast and agile. Stage 1 infected usually travel in packs. Do not let them swarm you. Infected Stage 2. Uses environment to hide and ambush victims. Will frequently flank and attack from behind. Approach with caution and check your surroundings. Infected Stage 3. Completely blind. Acute hearing. Uses echolocation to seek out prey. Keep your distance. Stage 3 infected are known for their ferocious attacks and are extremely lethal. Infected Stage 4. Rare but dangerous evolution of Stage 3 infected. Incredibly strong and capable of throwing acidic projectiles. Do not engage unless absolutely necessary. When a cordyceps host dies, they will crawl toward a corner of a dark room. The cordyceps will extend and reach out and bloom quite violently across the corpse of their human host. In service to the unforgiving pathogenic fungus's mission to spread no matter what, the remnant shells of humans serve as the breeding ground for potential hosts. So we've spent some extended time on YouTube.com talking about death cults. The very serious and pernicious threat that lurks behind the scenes of the social world, causing unnecessary cruelty and death via their persistent negligence and entrenched ideological commitment to doing nothing about the world's biggest threats. And while we could be here all day talking about the death cult, it's important to widen our focus because we've entered something of a fungal zombie moment. And this has a lot to say about contemporary ideological formations in culture and how to recognize them. Films like Cargo, The Hallow, along with games like The Last of Us, they share discourse, this implicit understanding that type of horror exists in a form and place that is beyond our immediate grasp. When I consider the modern subject, when attempting to observe a linear and discernible reflection of that subject, we're confronted by a distortion that alters and changes even with our finest movements. We shift and move naturally in our bodies, and the image in front of us destabilizes. What we're looking at seems to never be exactly what it actually is. We struggle to articulate our own feelings of alienation in our contemporary moment because that very alienation is procedurally anamorphic, able to create new images of itself via various hosts and new environments. Across various planes of reflection and shapes and sides we can't even begin to see. Just as you think you've spent enough reflective time to understand what you're even looking at. Yeah, well, things change, right? The overwhelming presence of capitalist ideology, it has us running helplessly from vantage point to vantage point in an attempt at new perspectives and possibilities for change. This is precisely the problem. Stop. Close your eyes. Now, do you feel it? Sitting in your lungs, hovering in the air around you, nestled into the gaps and folds and creases of your body, swirling along tiny indoor air patterns in these sweet shapes that find a tunnel upward and fan out in new, unanticipated directions.
I think there is a danger in getting too drawn to the question of agency. In terms of capitalism and its ideological structures, the question of agency, when you take the long view, is kind of diffuse. This isn't to say that we don't know who our enemies are, right? We can name names. But we have to remember that that doesn't necessarily solve everything, right? What maintains the deep ideological structures of the present are historical processes which have been iterated upon over and over again, over decades, over generations. We're dealing with assemblages, not subjects. Much as we might like to think otherwise, there is no single villain pulling the strings behind the scenes. Any analysis of the ideological structures of capitalism has to go further than the end of every episode of Scooby-Doo. Pull off the mask and what do you find? It's not personal. It's just business. When it actually arrives, capitalism brings with it a massive desacralization of culture. It is a system which is no longer governed by any transcendent law. On the contrary, it dismantles all such codes, only to reinstall them on an ad hoc basis. The limits of capitalism are not fixed by fiat, but defined and redefined pragmatically and improvisationally. This makes capitalism very much like The Thing in John Carpenter's film of the same name, a monstrous, infinitely plastic entity, capable of metabolizing and absorbing anything with which it comes into contact. In a way, this is the problem with thinking about spores. Maybe it naturalizes something that shouldn't be, because if capitalist ideology in all of its infinite plasticity, is natural, then God, what do we even have to hope for? But the point wasn't to make it seem natural. The point was to decenter this idea of a singular agent, a single subject that had to be confronted. We're surrounded by particular kinds of assemblages, but as Fisher goes on to talk about, the grounds for hope rests precisely in the fact that none of this is natural. So the answer to that question of what the hell do we even do here begins in the tradition of immanent critique. We can't position ourselves outside of capitalist ideology. It's here with us now, but we can recognize where we are and our own involvement with it. Critique, no matter how much we might like to think otherwise, never stands on the outside in some position of purity. It's never outside of its own object. And before all of this gets too bleak, it's important to remember that the non-naturalized state of capitalist ideology means that, try as it might, it can never totally foreclose the possibilities of revolutionary rupture and change. The weird agency of capitalist ideology has its dialectical inverse, the agency of the class for itself. Class consciousness is a kind of becoming, and capitalism, try as it might, can never erase the fact that, as the Communist Manifesto put it, what the bourgeoisie produces is therefore its own gravediggers. If we think about this in terms of models of becoming, spores mutate us, but into something new. To use another horror analogy, it's not, oh God, what did they do to you? But rather, oh God, what might we all become?
I remember a certain point in the writing process, maybe a paragraph, where Tony and I wrote, "Revolution is really only for monsters." And what we meant was that it's not as if you should imagine revolution as creating that society where you are finally going to feel at home. Some people might wish for that, but that's not revolution. It has to be the transformation of society so that you as you were can no longer live. So that you have to become something different in order to live it. And you might think about it, and this would be putting the love and revolutionary processes together, as it's not a letting go in an individual sense, but it's a letting go in a collective process, like a becoming.
I wish there was an easy answer here, right? I wish there was certainty, but change is inherently uncertain, unstable. And who knows what we might have to become to see a new world. At the moment, nobody Nobody trusts anyone anymore, and we're all very tired. No one is feeling great right now, are they? So, what do we do? Why don't we just wait here for a second? See what happens. See what we all could collectively become.
So lost. Rested against a large root system. Awoke to find Enemata virosa clusters pushing through my feet. It doesn't hurt anymore. Psilocybe azarescens are everywhere. I pushed my hand into a cluster. They'll take root in my fingers soon. I can't feel anything else.